All right, so now that we've concluded the war in Europe, the fighting on the Western Front and the Meuse-Argonne offensive and the German surrender in November 1918, attention gets turned to try to figure out what to do to not only resolve the instances that created this war in the first place, but also to try to take steps to make sure that nothing like this ever happens again. All right, and trust me, I am really aware of the irony when I talk about trying to prevent a war like this from ever happening again, because World War II is on the way, but we have to try to remember that they don't know this. They really think that this is a chance to sort of make a forever lasting peace all across Europe. When I say they, I'm really talking about American President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's idealism that we talked about back in 1914, he really saw this as an opportunity to make the world safe for democracy, and that this could be a war to end all wars. And maybe one other sort of catchphrase to drop in with this, he sees this as a way, and he sees it as really as an important opportunity to try to achieve peace without victory, because he felt that to have victors meant that you also have losers, and he wanted to make sure there was going to be a plan of peace that was put in place that would not punish the losers on this. And this is going to be where things start to break down. Even before the end of the war, as early as January 1918, so 10 months before the ceasefire takes effect, Woodrow Wilson puts out his plan for peace that is just referred to as the 14 points. There are 14 parts to his individual plan, and like the political cartoon here is showing us, like this is Kaiser Wilhelm, this is the depiction of like the German emperor, and the call for him is like to pay attention because this is the only way out to try to get the achievement of peace on this. And Wilson's plan is detailed, but it is in these details he sees a way to prevent future wars from breaking out. And I got to tell you, a lot of what shows up in Wilson's 14 points, they're the types of things that were showing up in progressive political agendas in the United States. Things like trying to protect free trade and trying to prevent there from being a barrier, or the secret alliances he saw as a problem because the secret alliances would lead to government intrigue, and he wants things to be much more open on a democratic basis and on an economic capitalist kind of basis. The 14th of the 14 points on this really gets into like sort of the catch-all that he sees as a way to protect these ideas for generations to come, and that's his idea of the League of Nations. But we can come to that here in a few minutes, because what we see on Wilson's idealism is that when he comes in interaction with the other Western allied powers, his idealism is not going to play so well with the practical reality that those political leaders are going to bring to the negotiating table. In this picture here, that was also the picture that we had on the title slide for this lecture. The big four that we've got represented here. On the far right side, this is Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. The fellow with the nice mustache standing next to him, this is Georges Clemenceau. He is the Prime Minister of France. Here is Vittorio Orlando. He is the Prime Minister of Italy, and then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, David Lloyd George. This is here on the left. These four men really represent what is historically referred to as the Big Four, the four primary interests that are going to be involved in the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles. And if you're trying to like ration this out and why is Italy there, Italy did some switching back and forth in the war, and there is an argument out there that Italy was actually instrumental in helping turn some of the tide on the Western Front. They contributed troops to fighting against the German army there the last phases of the war, so they've earned a right at the table. But these three European countries, they've got a very different set of perspectives than what Woodrow Wilson has. Whereas Wilson comes in with his idealism and a war to end all wars and a set of peace terms without having winners and losers. The Big Four are really kind of representing this in terms of a European reality. And in this reality, what they kind of argue back to Wilson is that your idealism is all well and good, but the United States did not fight this war on their own soil for 4 years. The United States fought this war across an ocean for really the period of like 14 months. And so there's a very different set of perspectives that the Western allies are bringing into these conversations. And these Western allies, they are going to, a great deal of compromise, and in some cases just out and out, they're going to defeat some of Wilson's idealism that's found in the 14 points. When they lay their peace terms on the table, we can kind of see a couple of things that are going to have a long-term impact, both for European history and for history leading us into World War II and the Cold War and future American interactions. So with the peace terms, we can turn attention first and foremost over to Eastern Europe. And what we can kind of see on this map is that the map is going to see like new nations or reconstituted nations being built in. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, I'm not going to read all the names of the countries to you, but this block that is really like the Eastern Front in Europe, it is really a massive change of what's happening on the map. This reflects part of Wilson's idealism, because these countries are going to be created and kind of have like an element of Republican democracy that's going to come into play. I think the reality of how this plays out in Eastern Europe, though, is some of the consequences of actions in the 1920s and 30s, Great Depression and the rise of the Soviet Union, and a little bit later on, the rise of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. These Eastern European countries are going to struggle to survive. And so, good intentions in here, but and maybe not the long-term impact that Wilson's idealism really would have wanted to have. The other thing, maybe the biggest thing that the Big Four are going to work into the Treaty of Versailles is what they call Article 231. This is the German war guilt clause of the war. This is going to require Germany to accept responsibility for starting the war, which is kind of arguable if you look at this kind of going back to 1914, as the war like initially started in Sarajevo, Yugoslavia, Serbia, and then Austria declaring war, and then the Russians declaring war, and then the Germans declaring war. The justification that they use on this war guilt clause for the Western Allies, they say that Germany is really responsible for all of the war here in Western Europe, which is true. But this is also going to completely challenge Wilson's idea of peace without victory, because the punishment that comes into this isn't just the fact that Germany's going to accept the blame, it's the fact they're going to accept paying reparations, war damages, war payments that are designed to compensate the British and the French, primarily the French on this, because the war was in northern France and Italy to a certain point, but not the United States. The total dollar amount on these war reparations is $33 billion. That was billion with a B, and that's $1919. So when you adjust that for inflation for 2025, that makes it in the neighborhood of $640 billion. And this is a pretty steep price tag to pay, especially at a point in time where governments didn't really spend that kind of money. And there's real questions out there about Germany's ability to pay it. And there's going to be some consequences that'll happen in terms of the 1920s and 30s and World War II on the way. The other part of the Treaty of Versailles that does come into effect, and it does reflect Wilson's 14 points, is the creation of the League of Nations. But the League of Nations is going to be beleaguered with problems, no pun intended on that. It's going to be faced with a lot of problems as they're trying to sort of make sure that the war isn't going to repeat itself in some way, and trying to do this in a context where the German economy is going to be almost like perpetually in debt as things come to pass on this. So before we get a little bit further into League of Nations, just a side note that the $33 billion in war reparations. The German government, by the time the Nazis take over in the early 1930s, these payments stopped altogether. And it's only in the late 1940s when payments are resumed on this. There is a good faith agreement coming from the German government that they will pay all of these World War I reparations. They will pay them all in full, and that job was completed in 2010. 90 years after those reparations were laid in place against them. So some long-term consequences there. But we need to look at the short-term consequences that are going to hamper the job of the League of Nations and maybe draw some real questions about what the role of the United States is supposed to be through all this. So trying to lay the context and the timeline together on this. Woodrow Wilson developed the concept for the League of Nations as part of his 14 points. That was published initially back in January 1918. And then in January 1919, a full year later, Wilson is in Versailles negotiating the Treaty of Versailles with the other Western allies. And the League of Nations charter is included in that peace treaty development, that treaty negotiation. But in order for that treaty to take effect for the United States, Wilson has to bring the treaty home, and the United States Senate has to confirm it. They have to ratify it. And so this is part of like the American system of checks and balances. You need President and Congress working in conjunction with each other to have foreign treaties established and have those impact the United States. The problem that Wilson kind of faces, though, is that Wilson is a Democrat, and when he went to Paris for the treaty negotiations in 1919, he refused to take any American Republicans, or he refused to take, well, really kind of like listen to any Republican concerns about this, about the League idea and about the treaty altogether. And this is not really just a Democrat versus Republican thing. By the time you get to the beginning of 1919, the Republicans are the majority of what's in Congress, and so there's a real argument to be had here that Wilson may have made a crucial mistake by not including other American politicians in some of these discussions, simply because of the fact that the treaty has to be ratified by the Senate, by part of Congress, in order for this to truly take effect. So when Wilson comes home with the treaty and with the League Charter and is looking for it to be ratified by Congress, he is met with some serious opposition to certain aspects of the treaty. So there are a group of Republicans they condemn the treaty as being kind of un-American in different ways. We'll talk about those in just a second. But there's another group of Republicans that have just got reservations about some of the language that's in there. They want to see some changes come into play about the role that the United States would play in the League. So the one or two like central points to what's going on with this is that for a lot of Americans, a lot of Republicans, and some Democrats even, there was a real thought that this treaty would represent a violation of the Monroe Doctrine, that the United States being in the League of Nations would kind of create this permanent intermingling between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere that would challenge the Monroe Doctrine and George Washington's farewell address, for that matter. So really kind of undoing any sort of the traditional foreign policy standpoint that the United States would have. The other real point that they had against the treaty has to do with the Mutual Defense Treaty. Basically says that if any League member is attacked, all members of the League of Nations are required to declare war in their defense. So if France is attacked by Germany in the future, the League of Nations would require the UK and the United States and all other League members to defend France and declare war. And this, for some Americans, really was seen as a violation of the American Constitution, because the Constitution says that only Congress can declare war. And this was a real sticking point for a lot of people, like the questions over the power of the government and the power to declare war and where that should really go. the story on the treaty ratification and the ultimate defeat of the treaty, it is fairly, I mean, it gets long and drawn out. I mean, Wilson is refusing to compromise, and the Republicans are refusing to go along with his proposals. Wilson goes on a nationwide tour to try to get the American people to support the treaty. But in the midst of the tour, he has a stroke and is kind of, I mean, he's hospitalized and bedridden for the rest of his presidency. But by the time you get to 1921, the peace treaty is defeated in Congress. It's not ratified. And ultimately, it's going to lead to a separate, the United States is going to declare a separate peace with Germany in 1921. Like 2 years after the Treaty of Versailles is in place, the United States will finally make their peace with what's happening here. The political cartoon here, like the land bridge it's trying to put in between, like, to keep Europe all together, Belgium, France, England, Italy, everything on this bridge, these are all European countries, but the one stone that's missing that's kind of holding it all together is like the United States. And so this League of Nations bridge, pretty nice metaphor, the keystone that would give everything this stability, Uncle Sam has got it. Uncle Sam's just not willing to use it because of the, well, ongoing reluctance to be permanently involved in European affairs, which is going to be completely undone by the time the United States moves into the 1930s, going to the 1940s with the outbreak of World War II. And I think it's safe to say that even going to the 21st century, there's been a on again, off again debate about how much involvement the United States needs to have in European affairs. But this is really the first spot where we kind of see it as an actual debate. Everything beforehand, the debate has been closed. The U.S. should stay in the Western Hemisphere and Europe should stay in the Eastern Hemisphere. But now there's this ongoing debate still faced today over what the U.S. responsibility is to interact with and to maybe protect the rest of the world.